thanks everyone for coming out tonight. My name's Stefan Epkoop, and I was the person who put together the St. Vital Community Food Assessment. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And I've got a bit of a presentation, but really we don't need to treat it too much like a presentation. We can have questions and ideas and answers along the way. And then hopefully we've got a good amount of time at the end to have a little conversation and see what you think. So, first question, what is a food assessment? A food assessment is a way to think about food in a community, to talk about what are the issues that people are dealing with around food. It has a bunch of different parts. So one thing that we did a bunch of sort of research, looking at the numbers, finding out about different things from health to garbage to transportation. But we also then went out and talked to people, and that's probably the most important part of a food assessment, is talking about what matters to people in the community. So talking to different groups, different individuals about what kinds of things they're interested in, what kinds of things they're worried about, and then using that as a way to talk about food in a community. And in this case, we chose St. Vital. When we talk about food, you can see that I've sort of represented food here as a wheel. There's many different components to food. So it's not just sort of buying food and eating it. There's many different things. There's growing food, there's processing food, distributing food, selling food, buying food, cooking food, getting rid of the food when we're done with it. There's many different stages. And so when we put together something like the St. Vital Community Food Assessment, we wanted to try and look at all these different stages and see what it would look like, not just if we picked one component, which we could have, but we wanted to see what all of these components looked like together. You all know what St. Vital is, I'm guessing, but St. Vital goes as far north as Carrière Avenue, which is where Jardin Saint-Léon is in the north. That's sort of they're right on the northern edge of St. Vital, and it goes all the way past the perimeter, past the Red River floodway, just not too far beyond the floodways, maybe 500 meters, 800 meters beyond the floodway. So it's a pretty big area, and there's a lot of diversity within that. In that area, you have a lot of relatively new suburban housing, you have some older housing, you have high-income areas, low-income areas, and you also have lots of farms. St. Vital is home to over 10,000 acres of farmland that's still being farmed today. So if you think beyond the perimeter, there's a lot of farmland there. So there's a lot of diversity in St. Vital. Another question I often get asked is, why did you pick St. Vital? Of all the neighborhoods in the city, why look at St. Vital? So we looked at St. Vital for a few reasons. One is because St. Vital is so diverse that you can look at St. Vital and see a lot of the kinds of things that you'd see in other parts of the city as well. Because St. Vital it's kind of like a microcosm of the whole city. It's got a little bit of everything. So that's one reason why we picked St. Vital. Another reason is people always think of food often think of food as an inner city issue. So you think of food when you're thinking about the North End, or when you're thinking about West Broadway or downtown or places like that. But people haven't traditionally thought about food in the same way when they're thinking about the suburbs. They don't think of food challenges existing in suburban neighborhoods. And so this was a chance to see what are people in areas outside of the inner city thinking about food, and what kinds of challenges are they facing, and are there ways that those are similar to people in the inner city, and maybe there are different ways. These are just some numbers here, what it is showing is some of the differences within St. Vital. There are two very different communities, I guess, within St. Vital. One north of Bishop Grandin and one south of Bishop Grandin. If you look north of Bishop Grandin, the average income, for example, household income is $41,000 a year. You cross that line below Bishop Grandin, south of Bishop Grandin, that number goes up to $71,000. So there's a huge difference in income there between north and south. The northern part of St. Vital is a little bit closer to the Winnipeg average. South St. Vital is quite a bit above the Winnipeg average, so it's quite well-to-do on average. If you look at some other things as well, for example, the percentage of the population that's Aboriginal is 10% north of Bishop Grandin, 6% south of Bishop Grandin, and 10% is the city average on a whole. So northern St. Vital is pretty much the same as the rest of the city. One interesting thing about St. Vital is that it's a very young community. So there's a much larger percentage of people under the age of 19 than anywhere else, or than most other places in the city, and especially in southern St. Vital, in this part of the St. Vital, it's very young. So 1 in 3 people are below the age of 19. Compare that to some places in northern parts of St. Vital and other places in different parts of the city, and that number goes down to something like 10%. So this is a much younger population than you're going to get in most parts of the city. And when you have that creates different issues around food as well, different issues around food and kids. Just one more sort of statistic to throw at you here, and that's rented dwellings. And so just to show the kinds of housing that people are living in northern St. Vital, nearly half of people are living in rental units. So a lot of apartments, not a lot, or relatively low levels of home ownership. When you look at St. Vital, South St. Vital, only 1 in 10 people is renting. So huge differences there in terms of income, in terms of house ownership or rental, and so on. One interesting thing is that I have this big aerial photograph of all of St. Vital, and one day I was noticing there was a lot of green space in South St. Vital, and I started counting up the ball diamonds, and I counted up 19 ball diamonds south of Bishop Grandin. I thought, well, I looked north of Bishop Grandin, what did I see there? I found 6 of them. So it's relatively the same population in both, but one has 19 ball diamonds and one has 6. So there's a lot of, in this part of St. Vital, there's a lot of park space, a lot of open space, whereas in North St. Vital, they actually have one of the lowest levels of park space in the whole city, or in terms of access to parks, and sort of how far people live away from a park. You don't think of that often because, you know, St. Vital Park is there. I wouldn't have thought that there would be such a low level of park access, but that's actually one of the issues in northern St. Vital. This is just to give you a sense of some of the diversity in terms of income. And one thing that's interesting in St. Vital is that it's home to the lowest income neighborhoods outside of the inner city. So if you're thinking about food issues and poverty, that is an issue in St. Vital. So if you go up St. Anne's Road, just north of Bishop Grandin, that's where you're going to see some of the lowest incomes outside of the city's core. But you're also going to see some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. So I think there are 2 or 3, or I guess 2 neighborhoods that are in the top 5 in the city in terms of income, and there's several neighborhoods that are sort of in the bottom tier as well. So you've got everything from the highest to the lowest incomes, and that presents challenges around food, particularly folks with low incomes. One of the things that I wanted to see was if there were any diet-related information about St. Vital. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of issues you can see there. So one of the staggering things that we found was that there was a very high percentage of overweight and obesity in St. Vital, higher than the city average. 70% when you combine the two. Now that's that is higher than most other areas of the city, and I think we have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt because there's a very high margin of error. They're sampling a small segment of the population, but it does show that it does raise some questions. What's also interesting is that 2/3 of people do not eat the appropriate amounts of fruit and vegetables every day. Sort of the recommended daily intakes of fruits and vegetables, 2/3 are not getting that amount. One of the prominent chronic diseases in Manitoba now is diabetes, and diabetes rates are comparatively low in St. Vital at around 7%, but still is a growing concern as we look forward. So a little bit about food and economics. So food relates to our health, it relates to the economy as well. St. Vital is home to 175 food businesses. That includes grocery stores, greenhouses, why am I blanking on this? Restaurants, and so on. When I looked at some numbers, I can estimate that there's around $200 million that people in Saint Vital are spending on food every year. So that's a lot of money, and the way that money is spent can do pretty interesting things depending on how that money is spent. For example, if even 10% of that money was purposely spent on local foods, let's say, that's $20 million being spent on local foods. That's a huge difference that can be made in Saint Vital alone. How much access do people have to grocery stores? So for example, if you have a car, it's pretty easy to get to a grocery store. If you don't have a car, it's a whole lot harder. I heard stories in some Manitoba housing communities of how on check day it's like, and the person told me it's like a parade of cabs coming down the block as people bring home their groceries. So it's a sad state of affairs when the people who have the least to pay for, the least money to spend on food in our society are spending the most money to bring that food home. One of the things that I looked at was the idea of food access. So how far away are people from grocery stores? If you want to create a sustainable community, a community where people don't have to drive all the time, you want to have grocery stores, which are a pretty essential service, close to where people are living. Now, there's different definitions out there of what a walkable distance to a grocery store is. Some places say that it's a kilometer. If you're within a kilometer of a grocery store, it's walkable. Other places say it's only 450 meters, so that's a lot, and that's not a very far walk, but I guess they figured since you're carrying a lot of groceries, you don't want to have to walk very far. If you look at sort of the percentage of people that are within a kilometer of a grocery store, it's about 50%. So that's not bad, and that's a lot of people that are within a fairly large walkable distance. But if you shrink that circle down to 450 meters, then only about 10%, I believe, 10% of people are within that walkable distance. And if you take out North Saint Vital, where everything's a little bit closer, you just look at the southern part of Saint Vital where we are now, only about 5%, 1 in 20 people is within a walkable distance of a grocery store. So if we're thinking about, how do we make our communities sustainable, that's maybe one thing that we need. We need more grocery stores, more places to get food. One of the interesting things that I did is I thought, well, okay, it's fine to be close to a grocery store or far from a grocery store, but there are people who've done research that say it doesn't matter how far you are away from a grocery store. What actually matters is the difference between how far you are away from a grocery store and how far you are away from a fast food restaurant. The idea is that if it's more convenient, if a fast food restaurant is closer to you than a grocery store, it becomes more convenient for you to go to a fast food restaurant, and so you'll go there more often. So I did all my calculations again and found all the distances to fast food restaurants from all these different points in Saint Vital, and found that there's lots of areas in Saint Vital that are much closer to fast food than they are to grocery stores. And interestingly enough, then I took all of those areas. Saint Vital is divided into 110 different areas, so quite small pockets. And I sorted them by income. And then I looked again at this food balance. And what I found was that areas with the highest incomes had the best food balance. So we're closer to grocery stores but further away from fast food. And as the income went down, the food balance got worse. So if I divided them into quintiles, so 5 different groups, the highest one had the best food balance. The second highest income had the second best food balance. The third highest had the third best food balance. Fourth had the fourth, and fifth had the fifth. It seemed to, as income went down, the food balance got worse. So the places with the lowest incomes have more fast food restaurants and less grocery stores. Now, what's interesting in Saint Vital, what skews that a little bit is that the lower income areas are actually quite close to grocery stores, but they are also even closer to fast food restaurants. I would take that with a bit of a grain of salt, because there are some grocery stores within relatively close distance of many of the low income areas in Saint Vital. But it was very interesting that there seemed to be this connection that as incomes dropped, fast food restaurant access went up. I mentioned that there were farms in St. Vital, and this is something that you may not have known, but there are 155 farms in the city of Winnipeg. The city of Winnipeg extends beyond, in some places, extends beyond the perimeter. So it takes in a lot of agricultural land. About 40,000 acres of land is under cultivation in the city. And about 10,000 acres of that is in St. Vital. And you can do most of the agricultural activities that you can do on a farm anywhere else in the province in a farm in Winnipeg. There are some rules about, in certain areas you can't have certain animals or different things like that, but by and large, these are agricultural areas. In fact, in Winnipeg, farms in Winnipeg brought in $32 million of farm receipts, so of income, of revenue, every year. One of the big challenges that we face in our society is food waste. I've seen studies that show that we waste more food in North America than some countries have food to eat on a daily basis. And there's other studies that have shown that like half of food doesn't even get to the grocery store. It's wasted prior to that point. One of the things I wanted to learn was how much food are we wasting here, or how much food are we throwing out here in Winnipeg, and what's the environmental impact of that? And fortunately, someone had the wisdom a couple of years ago to go through people's garbage. And the city of Winnipeg did this in a few different neighborhoods. They went through everybody's garbage and found out exactly how much of every different kind of thing. They had a whole list of pages and pages of different kinds of items people were throwing out. Interestingly, so kitchen waste, kitchen food waste was one of those things that they measured. And we discovered that every person in Winnipeg, or on average, is throwing out to the landfill 83 kilograms of food every year. And that's just at home. That's not when they go out to a restaurant. That's not when they are at work or anything else. That's just at home. So 83 kilograms a year per person. So if you have a household of 4, then you're throwing out 320 kilograms of food every year, just in your one household. Now the thing about food waste is that can all be turned into something useful. That can all be turned into compost. None of that waste needs to actually happen. When you throw food waste into the landfill, it creates methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so, I want to make sure I get this right. But when you, the amount of food waste, if we took all that food waste in St. Vital and instead put it in compost, and there's ways to do that on sort of a city-wide level or a neighborhood-wide level where you just pick it up. Other cities have compost pickup, so it's no more difficult than throwing it in the trash. It would be like taking 1,600 cars off the road, just in St. Vital. So if you did it across the city, it'd be roughly like multiplying that by 10. It'd be around 16,000 cars. It'd be like taking 16,000 cars off the road every year. One of the things that excited me about St. Vital was all of the different activities already happening in this community around food. I came up with a list as part of the food assessment that went on for several pages. Where's my list here? Or a page and a half or so. So a small little font going all the way up the page and then halfway through the next. Many different kinds of things: community gardens, community kitchens, different food classes, different kinds of breakfast programs, a public orchard. Winnipeg's first public orchard actually is on the Bishop Grandin Greenway. Nutrition classes, transportation, access to grocery stores, all kinds of different things are happening here. One of the neat things that I saw was intergenerationality, where one example is from St. Vital Knights Villa, which is on St. Anne's Road, just north of Bishop Grandin, and they've had a garden there for a number of years, but this year they decided they would invite the next door daycare center to come garden with them. So you have a seniors residence and a daycare center cooperating to garden together. And I think eventually at the end of the year they then invited the parents of the kids from the daycare center to come over, and they had a big picnic celebration. So neat things like that where people are sharing their skills, sharing their talents, and also making connections across different age groups. Community gardens were very interesting. Compared to other suburbs, St. Vital has a lot of community gardens. I think around 6.5 acres of community garden space in the whole neighborhood combined. These are in different places throughout the community. The biggest one is at St. Amant Center, where they have 110 plots that are 25 feet by 50 feet. So these are pretty significant garden plots. But they're all over the neighborhood. And one thing that's interesting about these gardens is that there's way more people who want them than there are garden spaces. The city quit keeping track of the waiting list a couple of years ago. I think in part because they no longer have a sort of a full-time person doing work on community gardens, so they didn't have the resources to keep up a waiting list. Now there's a garden just south of Bishop Grandin Road on Avalon, and it's there's 24 plots, I believe, in that garden, and there were 34 people on the waiting list when they quit keeping track. So there were more people who wanted to get in than that were actually able to be in. And the story was similar across the other community gardens in the neighborhood. I think the South Winnipeg Garden Club, which runs the St. Amant Center Garden, they have a waiting list of at least 20 people there hoping to garden. There's waiting lists in other places as well. So there's both a lot of community gardening happening in St. Vital, but also a lot of interest in doing more community gardening. So these are some of the issues now that I heard from people when I got out to have conversations with folks. And probably the biggest one, the one that came up over and over again, was the idea of food skills. Sort of the lack of, concern about a lack of basic food skills, being able to prepare food. One mother told me the story of how she, after her first child was born, she started going to a cooking class in her community. She was interested in learning some new recipes, and she was surprised. The first day they were making apple crisp, and she was surprised that there were people in her group that didn't know how to cut up the apples, let alone sort of make the apple crisp. So sort of concern about even most basic food literacy. And what was interesting to me about this is it came up no matter where I had a conversation. So I could be sitting in a living room sort of in far south St. Vital, sort of deep in suburban St. Vital, or I could be sitting in a Manitoba housing complex, or I could be, chatting with newcomers or seniors or people working with kids, and it was the same story across the board. It wasn't a matter of, people with low incomes can't cook, but people with high incomes can. No, that wasn't the story. It was everybody was dealing with these issues. And so I think that's one thing that was interesting that came out from this process, was this was a commonly held concern. Interestingly enough, of course, people rarely say, I can't cook. They always say, oh, other people can't cook in my community. So maybe there's a little something there. But some ideas that came up were more community kitchens or cooking classes, and having those in places like schools that are facilities that aren't used very much in evenings but are around in all kinds of neighborhoods, or using community centers. They tend to have good kitchen facilities there. I mentioned there was sort of a concern about community garden space, and so this was another issue that people were facing, and so trying to get more of it in the community. Another idea that came up was the idea of yard sharing. And so people with yards that have space but aren't able to use it, maybe they've have challenges with mobility, or maybe they're too busy, or what have you, but inviting someone else to be able to use that garden space, and maybe they get some of the produce or something, but being able to come up with connections like that. There were issues about sort of poverty and hunger in St. Vital. I think there are 14 Winnipeg Harvest drop-off sites in St. Vital alone. So it's not there are hunger issues in this community. And I think that's one concern that people had, was that people don't think about hunger when they think about St. Vital. They tend to think, sort of the stereotype is that it's fairly well off, that it's at least middle income. It doesn't face some of those challenges. But as it was pointed out to me, some of the city's lowest income neighborhoods are within a stone throw of the city's most lucrative mall. So you have sort of juxtapositions of wealth and poverty within relatively close proximity. There are some ideas about this ranging from the very small to the very large. So everything from sort of developing little community gardens in those neighborhoods to raising welfare rates and everything in between. I mean, there's sort of big scale solutions to problems, and there's also sort of small things that can happen at a community level. There were ideas about local food as well. This is something that people were looking for. There are a few places to find it here in St. Vital, but trying to make that more accessible to people. One idea that came out that was linked both to local food and to the idea around poverty and hunger was the idea of a good food club and our good food boxes. And good food boxes are something that are going to happen citywide. The idea behind them is that people pay for a box, and they pay essentially for the wholesale price of the box, but they get then so they pay, let's say, $20, and they get essentially a retail value of, let's say, $30 worth of produce. And then the distribution piece is subsidized so that they don't have to pay that piece. And that way you make fresh, healthy foods available to people who otherwise would not be able to access them. And you can also incorporate then perhaps some local elements into that as well, especially during seasons when local produce is more available. So that's an idea that came out. There are other ideas as well, like little pocket markets perhaps. So almost like a farmer's market, but maybe you just have one or two vendors that set up on a location. Maybe that's a location where people have less access to get to a grocery store. So like a senior's residence where people may not be able to get to the grocery store as easily, but if they have a little pocket market right there, they can get their vegetables and their fruit or whatever for that week. Perfect. There were ideas about connections and cooperation. So there's a lot of enthusiasm. A lot of people have ideas or are trying to do things, but may not always know how to get started. And so, but there's also a lot of people who have been doing things for a long time, and so trying to make those connections between people who want to do things and people who have that experience to help guide people who are doing things. And we talked about all kinds of other things as well. Schools, for example, what can happen at schools, whether that's composting programs or school gardens and so on. Talked about challenges with seniors. So, for example, especially senior men who perhaps haven't done a lot of cooking in their lives, if their wife passes away before them, then all of a sudden they're left trying to cook for themselves for the first time in their life, and that can be a very intimidating and challenging thing. One really interesting program in this community through Uville Center is Nutrition on the Go, which is a program that brought seniors together as a cooking class at first, and that was going really well. So then they thought, how about we partner with a school? And so then they had the cooking class, or they sort of, with the things they learned how to cook, they then cooked them for students at a school. And so then the school had a hot lunch program through Nutrition on the Go. And this year they've taken it a step further, where not only are they having students learn how to, or they're having seniors doing the cooking, but they're also inviting the students from the school into the cooking as well. So you incorporate that food skills element for the students as well, not just the seniors. And you're also then giving seniors and students a chance to interact and doing all kinds of other really good things. One of the most interesting places that I visited this summer, and there's a little picture of it here on the top of the pamphlet, is a garden, Peaceful Village Garden, which is located sort of behind the parking lot for George's on St. Mary's Road, just north of Bishop Grandin. They are a group of newcomers. There's 20 families who are gardening there. This was the first year last year that they were able to garden there, and they just got into their garden it was very late, maybe mid-June. By the time I visited in September, it was one of the more successful gardens I have ever seen. I think these folks know how to grow food. Most, if not all of them, had been farmers in their home countries. There are gardeners there from several African and Asian countries. And it was amazing what was happening there. At the beginning of the gardening season, there were some folks there from St. Vital and some folks who'd come down from downtown. The ones from downtown didn't have a bus pass at first, so they walked from downtown to Bishop Grandin every day, there and back, for the first several weeks of their gardening season. After that, they were able to get some bus passes. They found, I guess they were able to find some funding for bus passes, and that made life a whole lot easier. But there were numerous other things that were happening there as well. One thing was that people were able to sell some of the produce that they were growing at Central Market, which is downtown in Central Park. They were able to do what they loved to do. They were able to do what they knew how to do. I can imagine if I were in a new country where I couldn't speak the language and my professional skills were of no value, that I would really enjoy sort of being able to do what I was good at. They were also able to meet other people and get out and about, have a place outdoors for their kids to play, be able to teach their kids about these skills that they knew about growing food, be able to eat fresh foods from their home countries that are otherwise pretty much impossible to get here. Lots of the plants that they were growing are not things that we would normally see in a typical Canadian garden, but they were having some success growing them here. And also one thing that was interesting is it's right next door to a seniors residence. And at the beginning of the growing season, the seniors were really reticent about having these folks garden at this on this land. They didn't want people traipsing back and forth and coming in and making noise and causing disruptions. But halfway through the year, some of them came. The ones who had made sort of the biggest fuss at the beginning came to the gardeners and said, we really appreciate having you here. It's been remarkable how you've been able to turn this into a beautiful space, and we really enjoy that you're here. And when I was there in September, we had our meeting in part of the seniors residence. They were giving them space to be able to use inside as well, and giving them access to water and all kinds of neat things too. So they were able to make connections that never would have happened otherwise. And I think that speaks to the power of food to bring people together, to create opportunities for connections, and to also create opportunities for learning and interaction between different people who may never have otherwise come into contact with each other. The final question I always ask people when I had conversations with people was, how do you imagine Saint Vital, let's say in 2025, just to pick a random number, how do you imagine Saint Vital, and what would food look like in this community? What would food look like in an ideal Saint Vital? So I can see that you're kind of pondering what your futures would look like for Saint Vital. There were numerous things that came up, I think, when I talked about this with folks. And there were some connections that sort of connected different ideas that people had. I think they were all sort of centered around an idea of connectedness in one way or the other. So the idea that, you could go down the street and there'd be a small grocery store there where you could get a lot of your food, and you would know the person who was selling it to you, and that was seen as something that was a good thing. Or where they could be a little farmer's market in a neighborhood, and people could go there and would interact with their neighbors and interact with the farmers, and that was a good thing. Or having people growing food on their own yards, and you'd walk down your street and you'd see your neighbors growing food, and you'd trade your peas for their beans or whatever. You'd develop a sense of neighborhood and a sense of community. Also talked about a community where people were not hungry, where people had access to food, where when kids showed up for a snack program, the first question, or when kids showed up for an activity, their first question wouldn't be, what are we having for snack? Because I haven't eaten lunch, but what are we doing for our activity today? And I think that one sort of the overarching idea then is one of connectedness, of building connections with neighbors, of building sort of a healthy and vibrant community that is both sort of that enables people to access a lot of these foods, whether that especially local foods, and able to do that in their community, to be able to walk to their stores, be able to garden, to be able to share with their neighbors, and build a community in that way. Finally, I guess one thing that we did was we developed a website, and you can see a lot of stories on the website. The web address should be on here. Yes, it is foodinsaintvital.ca. Foodinsaintvital.ca. One thing that I did along the way is I put a lot of the stories of people that we met with, people that we talked to, like the Saint Vital Knights Villa Garden with the daycare, these newcomer gardeners, put those stories on the website. And so there's a lot of little pieces of information there, as well as a lot of neat stories about different activities that are happening in this neighborhood. I guess to finally say that doing this process was a really neat way to get to know a part of our city in a whole new way. St. Vital is a neighborhood that I had come to occasionally because I have some relatives in this area, so I'd come to visit, but kind of go in and out. But really appreciated the opportunity to be able to get to know more of the character of the place and some of the energy and enthusiasm and opportunities that exist here. I pointed out that there's a list here of places to get involved, and there's a number of different ways that people can get involved around food in St. Vital. One of them is the Bishop Grandin Greenway. It's entirely volunteer run and driven. They have a community garden on the Greenway. They're thinking about maybe doing more in the future, and they also have a public orchard there that's very much in its sort of infant stages. The trees are very young. If you blink, you will miss it. I walked back and forth a few times on the Greenway before I finally convinced myself that I had found it. But it's there, and hopefully will be a really neat resource for the community for years to come. There's the South Winnipeg Garden Club that I mentioned, and they are their gardens are behind St. Amant Center. I'd really encourage you to check it out sometime in the summer when things are growing, because it's a beautiful place to be. It's right along the river. I've never seen a community garden that has sort of the kinds of infrastructure that they do. So they have irrigation for their whole garden, so that anyone can just plug into the irrigation system and water their plot, and a bunch of other things there too. To point out a couple others, St. Vital Agricultural Society every summer has the St. Vital Fair. The fair has been running for over 100 years, reminiscent of some of the agricultural history of this neighborhood. You can enter your favorite cabbage or zucchini or beet or whatever you'd like and they have all kinds of activities and prizes and things. That runs over a weekend in summer, I think in August. And also point out Fruit Share, which runs across the city but also includes St. Vital. They have a number of trees or fruit, people with fruit in this area, as well as a number of pickers who come to this area to pick fruit. And so if you're wanting to get access to some fresh fruit this summer but don't already have access, I'd encourage you to sign up for that. So that's what I have to say, but certainly would be interested in your questions or ideas or thoughts about food in St. Vital.